Hello, this is chapter 7, and this chapter is on GDP or gross domestic product. So gross domestic product is everything that we produce, all goods and services that are produced domestically. There's a circular model. So everything we produce, workers produce products and services, they get paid for that, they spend money. And purchase things and purchase goods and services. So GDP, it's actually a circular model. So GDP equals income. So when you think about GDP, that equals our income. So if GDP rises by 3% this year, it should rise by a little more than that, hopefully, but let's just say that GDP increases by 3%. That means that our income has increased by 3%. And you can look, after you read this chapter, be sure and go into Moodle, the articles for discussion. I have several articles on GDP. And so you can look at GDP per capita by country. And so what they break down is GDP, gross domestic product per person, which equals income per person or per capita. And so you can see the countries that are the wealthiest, and it'll give you there's a list of GDP per country. And then there's other articles in there too that you can look at talking about, it gets into the whole issue of, does money buy happiness, or GDP and happiness? Are the wealthiest countries the happiest countries? And so if you look at the wealthiest countries, it's the Scandinavian countries that are the wealthiest. And then we're down there not too far. So generally, the conclusion is yes, money buys happiness. That the wealthiest countries are the happiest countries. But I wouldn't go as far to say that money buys happiness, because if you're a miserable person without money or with not a lot of money, you'll probably still be a miserable person when you have money. But even though money doesn't necessarily buy happiness, it certainly reduces stress in your life and can give you freedom. Frees up your time. I would say that that money doesn't necessarily buy happiness, but a lack of money can sure buy misery, so to speak. Okay, so enough of that. But look at those articles. There's some interesting articles in there on GDP and happiness and the GDP per country. Last thing I want to say about that is you'll see that there's some real interesting charts as far as GDP and happiness, because in general, the wealthier countries are happier. But when you look at countries like the Latin American countries, for example, Costa Rica, Mexico, they're way down on the income, the per capita income and our GDP, but they're way up there for happiness. And so they talk about that. It's talked about that. Why is that? Why are those countries who basically don't really have a lot of money, why are they happy? And so they've come to the conclusion, economists have come to the conclusion that it's the culture, and that the culture in Costa Rica, or the Latin American culture, really values close friendships. They really value family. They're wealthy in their friendships and family ties. They don't have to have money or material possessions. So that's really an interesting outcome. Okay, getting back to this now. So what are the key elements of GDP? Well, to calculate GDP, you simply take the price of final goods times the quantity. So let's say that you had oranges. How many oranges were produced in this country times the price of oranges. That's your number for oranges. Next year, if you produce the same quantity, but the price goes up, nominal GDP is going to go up. Nominal meaning the actual stated number, but real GDP hasn't really increased, right? Because just the price increased. So when we talk about GDP, we're talking about real GDP, and that adjusts for inflation. So the market value, so you have the market value, price times the quantity, and the real GDP adjusts for inflation. Now, when you look at when you go into Moodle and you look at the income per capita income, that is nominal. That's not real. That is not adjusted for inflation. So anyway, the key elements of GDP, you find the market value of all of the goods and services produced. It's got to be new products. Of course, used products are not counted for. They have to be domestically produced, and they have to be final goods and services. So the parts that go into a product are not counted, just the final product is counted. So if you're building a car, all the parts that go into building a car are not counted as part of GDP. The final car would count toward GDP. So that's GDP. Now, there's always an argument of, should we add things to GDP? Should we take away things from GDP? Because some things are not counted in GDP. So as I stated here, it's got to be new products. It's got to be domestically produced. It's got to be a final good final good and service. Well, what about do-it-yourself work? So let's say I came home from Nichols tomorrow and my toilet's broken, or my shower is broken, or my sink is broken. And I decide, well, I don't really want to hassle calling a plumber. If I called a plumber and hired a plumber to come out and fix it, and they're doing everything on the up and up and paying taxes and everything and reporting everything, I pay the plumber, that's part of GDP. But if I decide, let's just say a broken toilet. If I decide, I'm going to fix that toilet myself, I go to Lowe's and buy the parts, those would be considered final goods. But if I fix it myself, my labor, that's not going to be part of GDP. So any do-it-yourself work is not included in GDP. A stay-at-home mom or a stay-at-home dad, back in the day, I haven't seen this for years, but when you had more stay-at-home moms, the housewife, they would say, what's the value? What is the wage? This is like going back to like the 1990s. What wage should a housewife make? Well, a housewife, they were coming up with like 140 grand a year, because you're a nurse, you're a psychologist, you're a chef, you're a house cleaner. You can see, a stay-at-home person, mom or dad, does a lot. And so that's omitted from GDP. Also, any underground activity is omitted from GDP. So our GDP is underestimated because of all these things. Now, then they ask, well, should you subtract out things that reduce quality of life? For example, if you're producing goods and services, but they're polluting the environment, that's reducing the quality of life. So maybe you should subtract out the impact of pollution. But economists decided that's not realistic. It's too subjective. So that's not realistic. So they don't include, of course, they don't subtract out pollution. All right, now there's been some debate about including qualitative factors in GDP, like relationships and social networks and family. This ties into that GDP and happiness issue. So maybe we should include relationships, social networks, and family. That would increase the GDP of the Latin American countries. That's too subjective as well, though. So that has not been done. Now, you'll notice on page 42 of the book, they mention that research and development and creative activity, so artists and such, creative activity and research and development is now included in GDP. But not everyone's on board with this, because again, that's pretty subjective in nature. So make sure you read that new section on page 42. All right, so let me think if there's anything else I want to say about GDP. That's about it for GDP. So just remember that, there's, like anything, there's some flaws in the way it's measured, and make sure that you go to Moodle and look at those articles. Oh, I know what I wanted to say. There's a new article that I posted just last semester. You'll see the very bottom one, and it's nature and GDP. So they're getting into this whole conversation of, should we include the value of animals, the value of a whale, for example, in GDP, and come to the conclusion there, no, that's too subjective also, but that's kind of interesting. All right, so when you think about GDP, remember main takeaways, gross domestic product. And in the real world, I mean, what we're really looking at for GDP is we want to look at the growth. What is the growth rate of GDP? Is our GDP increasing, or is it staying stagnant, or is it decreasing? And when there's a link there where you can see the growth rates in GDP. So we typically, our GDP, our gross domestic product, has typically grown at a rate of about 2 to 3% per year. Now that we're coming out of COVID, we've had higher rates. And when you look at the chart, it's really interesting. You can see how much GDP dropped when COVID hit and then rebounded. When we're in a recession, GDP actually, the growth rate actually is negative. And but like I say, our average is 2 to 3%. Compare that to China, which China typically has a growth rate of GDP of around 5 to 7%. Well, number one, that's not sustainable. They're an emerging, they're still considered an emerging country, but that growth rate is not sustainable. And number two, you really can't trust the numbers that come out of China. So people don't really think it's that high, but even if it were, it's not sustainable. So 2 to 3% growth rate is good for us, and that's what we strive to do. Okay, so that's chapter 7, GDP. Take care.